Good morning, everyone. Please open your Bibles with me to Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11 is where we'll be this morning. I would like to continue the thoughts I began developing last week about Israel in the wilderness. So as you turn there, let me just do a quick review of that sermon. So as you look at both the book of Hebrews, in particular Hebrews chapter 3, and the book of 1 Corinthians, in particular 1 Corinthians 10, both of those texts look at the wanderings in the wilderness as not only a negative time of life of Israel's history, but also as a parable for our own life. Because what the Hebrew author does and what Paul does in First Corinthians is demonstrate that the wilderness really demonstrates so many of the trials and tests that we ourselves face in life that it's a time that we need to look to. This is a section I have not done a lot of teaching and preaching from since I've been at Manslick. So the lesson last week, the one this week, and the next couple are just more introductory thoughts for us to begin thinking about all of the lessons we can glean from the wanderings in the wilderness. Last week, we looked at the concept of testing God. And if there's anything that the wanderings in the wilderness teach us about God, I said it in one sentence, the wilderness teaches us we should not test God, but we should trust God. Again, the wilderness teaches us we should not test God, but we should trust God. And even though we are separated by physical distance at this time, I really appreciated the follow-up conversations I had about that sermon. Many of you had the same thoughts and questions about that sermon, about, when exactly are we testing God? I don't know if this was mere coincidence or if we've been primed for it, but even our conversation on Wednesday night from Psalm 44 really fits into this about how do we trust God? Whenever we doubt and when we have questions, how do we actually take those to God and really trust Him? And those are the questions that Psalm 44 is urging us to consider, and really ties so well into what we talked about. But I think what we see from both the wanderings of the wilderness and Psalm 44 is this: amidst trials and tribulations, we are never to trust any other God, but we are to trust God. Yes, our fellowship and our covenant with Him is going to take maturation and growth, and it's a process, a sanctification process. Yet we are to continually trust Him. And even when we have questions and doubts, take those to Him and really trust God. So that was just a basic lesson about our covenant with God, our relationship with Him, and really learning from the mistakes that Israel made in the wilderness. The question, and this is on your bulletin handout, the question that I would like to deal with this morning is, how do I treat my neighbor? So the two great commands, of course: love the Lord thy God, and then love your neighbor as yourself. We talked last week about our covenant with God. What I'd like to do today is examine, what does the wilderness teach us about our relationships with our neighbor, our relationships with all those around us. What do the wanderings in the wilderness teach us about how we treat one another? To examine this question, we're going to look at Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. And to give an introductory point of where we are, you do need to back up just a couple of verses to Numbers 10. Looking at Numbers 10, verse 35, whenever the ark set out, that's the chest of the tabernacle, chest of testimony, whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." Sound like Psalm 44? And when it rested, he said, "Return, O Yahweh, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." What has just happened immediately before this is Israel has finally left Sinai. And this takes us to about a yearish out from everything that has happened in the Exodus, about a year or two from that point. And at this point, Israel is leaving Sinai, and they are going to begin their wanderings into the wilderness. Now, if you keep following into the book of Numbers, they have not yet sent the spies out. That doesn't happen until Numbers 13. Numbers 14, we examined briefly last week about that. This is probably the worst rebellion you find in the book. But in Numbers chapter 11, Israel is just beginning to set out from Sinai, and they are now on their way out. The exact date for this, by the way, I want to back up and show you, is in Numbers 10, verse 11. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. So here we are leaving Sinai, and we begin our wanderings into the wilderness. Now we have to stop and think what else happened. Israel has seen God work plagues in Israel. They have seen God separate the Red Sea. They have seen God come down in glory upon Sinai. They have seen God provide water from a rock. They have seen God provide food from nowhere. They have seen God send fire down from heaven. If there's any people that should be ready to trust God and to love their neighbor, it should be Israel. Yet that's not what happens. Numbers 11, verse 1. And the people of Israel complained in the hearing of Yahweh about their misfortunes. Before we even continue, you have to read that again. And the people complained in the hearing of Yahweh about their misfortunes. Israel has the Ark of the Covenant, that chest of testimony, has just set out before them, and the cloud of the Lord is leaving them. Yet the first thing that Moses records Israel doing is complaining. Now, we don't have details about the contents of this complaint. I don't think it takes much thought to guess what this is. They're tired, they're hungry, they're sick of being in the wilderness, they want comfort again. They want to be able to rest their heads somewhere familiar. They're just tired, and so they're just complaining. This is going to be the history of Israel through the wilderness, is they are going to gripe, and they are going to grumble, and they are going to complain. How does God respond to that? And when Yahweh heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of Yahweh burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Yahweh, and the fire died down. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because of the fire of Yahweh burned among them. Now, the rabble, isn't that an interesting word? The word rabble there is just it's a pejorative term for like a group. So, I mean, it's like the troublemakers. The rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." The word meat here, by the way, it doesn't fit our contemporary understanding of meat. The older English term, not Old English, but the older English term for meat was just more generally for food. They're just asking for food. It's kind of like the meat offering of Israel really didn't have meat on it. Coincidentally, it was of grain, but the people are just asking for food here. "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in their hand mills, or beat it in their mortars and boiled it in the pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it like was the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. So what's happening here? This is what we would call in our household, they're hangry. Y'all know what hangry is, right? You're angry when you're hungry. Israel's hangry here. They're tired of eating manna. They want leeks and melons and garlics and fish and everything they had in Egypt, and they're hangry. What then does Moses do about this? Verse 10. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of Yahweh blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to Yahweh, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them, that you should say to me, carry them on your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give this people to eat? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once if I find grace in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. Moses takes this very, very personally, because Moses goes to God, and essentially he's saying to God, you have given me the mission of guiding and shepherding this people, yet I can't meet their needs. I can't meet their needs. What am I to do about it? Moses at this point is teetotally, utterly spent. He's had it. I mean, he's had it. He has led Israel through the Red Sea. He has led them to Sinai. But at this point, he looks at their complaint and he's like, I have nothing to do about it. Verse 10, Moses heard the weeping throughout the clans, everyone at the door of their tent, and the anger of Yahweh blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Here, God responds with anger. God is angry at Israel because Israel is not trusting him. They're testing him. And they're grumbling and they're complaining and they're griping. Now, let me make one textual note about this. It's fascinating. As you work through Exodus 15 through 17, it's very similar to what you find in Numbers 11 through 14. I'll say those verses one more time. Exodus 15 through 17 is very, 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 very similar to Numbers 11 through 14. Because in both cases, you have Israel asking for food, Israel asking for water, water comes from a rock, Israel complains, God provides. What's interesting, though, is God responds to their complaints very differently in both accounts. Again, I'd urge you, read both of those accounts in full and just see how God responds to them. I think what's interesting is Israel has just come out of the Red Sea in Exodus 15. When they're thirsty and when they're hungry, God says, fine, I'll give you food. Fine, I'll give you water from a rock. Have whatever you need. It's kind of like a baby, right? Whenever Adam or Camden cry, in Brooklyn, she calls it a hunger cry. It's a hunger cry. I mean, the boys don't cry that much. We are so blessed with her crying. They do not cry that much, but when they are hungry, they have a hunger cry. They are hungry. What do you do about that? As a parent, what do you do whenever they're about 7 months now. What do you do when a 7-month child cries for food? Do you get angry at them for being hungry? Do you get angry at them for crying? Do you get angry at them when it's, Jessica would know this far better than me, let's be honest. When it's 3 a.m. and they're crying and they're hungry, do you get angry at that child? You may get frustrated, but no, you're like, they're children. They don't understand. They're babies. I mean, all they understand is their tummy is hungry. They need some milk on their stomach, and you're going to feed them. That's how God responds in Exodus 15 through 17. He's like, this is a newborn nation. They have been slaves in Egypt. They're coming to know me. If they're hungry, I'll feed them. If they need water, I'll give it to them. Whatever they need, that's fine. That's more how God responds in that case. No, he doesn't want them to test him. He wants them to have greater faith. But he's also like, they're an infant nation. By the time you get to the book of Numbers, things are different. They have seen all of the works of Yahweh. They have received covenant, and they have confirmed covenant. Israel has had, remember back to Numbers 10, verse 11, they have had in the second year, in the second month, okay? They have had months to come to know the Lord, to come to trust Moses, and even to come to know one another as a new nation. And God's like, y'all should be better than this. You should be better than this, okay? Now, this is more like responding. Brooklyn now is about 2 years and 6 months now. Whenever it's time for dinner, Brooklyn every time will come to the table. Every time come to the table. But then occasionally, if we have something she doesn't want, she won't eat. And then 30 minutes after dinner, she wants to eat. How do you respond to that? Well, still, of course, we feed her. I mean, don't think that we don't give her food, etc. But you respond very differently from how you do a 7-month baby, because it's like she's had the opportunity to eat. She had food set before her. She should know that I'm giving her stuff that's good. I'm not asking her to put gross, that's her favorite word, gross stuff in her mouth. It's good. Then you get a little bit more frustrated because it's like, sweetheart, you had the opportunity to eat. You had food put before you. We're not giving you cranberries 30 minutes after we just ate dinner because you should have trusted us that we're going to feed you. And if you're hungry, we're going to feed you. It's a little bit different then, right? And then, of course, whenever they become teenagers, I mean, I think my mom finally had the rule in the house when we were teenagers: if you don't like it, fine, go fix your own food. It's like, you're better than this. I've made this for you out of love, and I have taken the time for this. You should eat it. That's how God hears with Israel. He's like, y'all aren't babies anymore. Y'all have ratified covenant with me. You have come to trust me, and you should really know that I'm looking out for you. And yet you're grumbling, and you're complaining, and you're griping. That's all Israel's doing. So let's start negatively. What does Israel teach us about how we treat our neighbor? From the negative perspective, Israel teaches us, do not grumble. Do not complain. Because what happens is whenever one person starts to get a little bit hangry, it grows. I guess this is a timely idiom. It spreads like a virus. It grows throughout the camp. And then everyone is grumbling and crying and angry at God. So God's anger turns against them. But that's not how Numbers 11 ends. Numbers 11 has a contrasting story. And it really wasn't until Eric and I recorded our Spirit in the Old Testament class that a lot of the connections in Numbers 11 came together for me. As you end Numbers 11, the first part, God is angry. Fire's coming down. He's ready to consume them. Something very different happens in the second part of the chapter. Verse 16. Then Yahweh said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. And I will come down and talk with you there. And I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall, note this phrase, bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of Yahweh, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore Yahweh will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected Yahweh who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out from Egypt? But Moses said, the people among whom I am number 600,000 on foot. And you have said, I will give them meat. They may eat a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be gathered and slaughtered for them, and be enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, and be enough for them? And Yahweh said to Moses, is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So Moses went out and told the people the words of Yahweh. And he gathered 70 men, the elders of the people, and placed them around the tent. And Yahweh came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the Ruach, the Spirit that was on him, and put it on the 70 elders. And as soon as the Ruach rested on them, they prophesied, but they did not continue doing it. Now 2 men remained at the camp, one named Eldad, the other named Medad. There you go, Matt. There's another 2 names for Uz and Buzz, Eldad and Medad. And the Spirit rested on them. They were among those registered, but they had not yet gone out of the tent, and they prophesied in the camp. And a young man ran and told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, my lord Moses, stop them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all Yahweh's people were prophets, that Yahweh would put his Spirit upon them. And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. Do you notice what God does here? God provides 70 elders. Now, let me just read the last few verses of the text, and I'll go back and make some observations. Verse 31. Then a wind, anyone want to guess what that word is? A breath from Yahweh sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall before the camp, and a day's journey on this side, and a day's journey on the other side, around the camp about 2 cubits above the ground. And the people rose all that day, and all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. Those who gathered the least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them out for around the camp, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before they consumed it. The anger of Yahweh was kindled against the people, and Yahweh struck down the people with a great plague. Therefore, the name of the place was called Kibroth Hattava, because there they buried the people who had the craving. From Kibroth Hattava, the people journeyed to Hazeroth, and there they remained at Hazeroth. Still, God's anger burns against the people, and because of their grumbling and their complaining, he will judge them for that. But do you notice after Israel complains what God says to do? God says in verse 16, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. And I will come down and talk to you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you, and put them on it, and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. Here's what's interesting in Numbers 11. God will still judge Israel for their grumbling and their complaining. But God is going to relieve the burden of Moses by giving Israel elders who can make judgments of God by the Spirit. Do you notice the contrast here? The first part of the chapter, Israel grumbles against God, and it disheartens Moses. The second part of the chapter, God appoints elders to help Moses, and they relieve his burden by the Spirit. I think you all see the question and the choice that Numbers 11 gives us. There's two options and two forms of influence that we can have. We can either be a grumbler or we can be a burden bearer. Let me say that one more time. You can either be a grumbler or you can be a burden bearer. Now, let me start with the second one and make a few observations about the word bear. To bear burdens, that term is actually used of Yahweh in Exodus 19, verse 4, whenever God bore Israel on eagle's wings. It should be a familiar phrase from some of our songs. God himself had borne Israel. He bore Israel. And likewise, these elders, by the Spirit, were to bear Israel's burdens, taking all of it off of Moses. But then in the first part of the chapter, Israel grumbled and complained, and the rabble talked. Look at this word that is used throughout the rest of the book of Numbers. Look over to Numbers 14. The word grumble is used multiple times over in Numbers 14. Numbers 14, verse 1. All the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept all night. And the congregation of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Down to verse 27. Yahweh says, how long shall the wicked congregation grumble against me? Verse 29. Everyone who has grumbled against me. And if you look down to verse 36, the same thing. All the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made the congregation grumble against him by bringing up a bad report from the land. There you see the same contrast in that story, right? You have the 10 spies who grumble and the 2 that bear burdens. That's the choice. Are we going to grumble or are we going to bear burdens? It's used over in chapter 16. I'll give you these verses 11 and verse 41, and then over to chapter 17, verse 5. I want you to be turning to the Gospel of John with me. Go to the Gospel of John. Jesus is going to pick up on this narrative taken from Numbers 11 and Exodus 17 as well. And he's going to demonstrate the same type contrast here. Look over to John. In John chapter 6, this is after the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus proclaims that he is the bread of life. Notice what Jesus says in John 6, verse 35. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Okay? I am the bread of life. Verse 41. The Jews grumbled about him. They grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread that comes down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he not say, I've come down from heaven? Jesus answered to them, do not grumble among yourselves. Do not grumble among yourselves. The same word is used in verse 61 of the chapter. The word here for grumble, in Greek, it's actually an onomatopoeia. So that's a 10-point spelling bee word, right? Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeias are words that sound like the things they're describing. And the word here in Greek was gungadzo, or gunguzo. And that actually is an onomatopoeia for the murmuring of doves. Now, doves probably aren't as common to us, but it's kind of, I guess, similar to us, like the crying of a woodpecker. Let me explain what I mean by this. When I was a teenager, at one point, we had a woodpecker stuck in our chimney. And every hour of the day, that thing would howl and moan and coo. And oh, it was so annoying. It was just annoying. And I mean, you couldn't get the thing out easily unless you wanted to try to get down the chimney. But that thing would just coo all the time. And y'all understand, there's some birds that just make these annoying little sounds. And that's what was described here of gungadzo. Was it's sounding like a dove that's just, it's just an annoying little sound. That's what grumbling is. Grumbling is just that annoying murmuring and complaining and griping that goes on. Look over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The same point comes to focus over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 9. We must not put Christ to the test. Notice how both of our sermons from the last week are coming to a focus here. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, nor gungadzo, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Now, I want us to think quite practically about this for a moment. Are you a complainer, or are you an encourager? Are you a grumbler, or are you a burden bearer? Are you like Israel, who grumbled because they were hangry? Or are you like one of the 70 elders who were embodied with God's Spirit and sought to encourage their leader? Are you a grumbler, or are you a burden bearer? I think, quite honestly, it's very natural and very easy for us to grumble, right? What is more ubiquitous than grumbling and complaining? I mean, complaining's fun, isn't it? If you want to get a group of people talking, what do you start doing? Bring up something that everybody can complain about. Let's talk about politics. Let's talk about the weather. Let's talk about the degradation of society. Let's talk about, oh goodness, you can complain about anything, right? Are you a grumbler? Are you a burden bearer? I think far too often, I will admit, I'm a grumbler. I'll be very honest. It's very, very easy to be a grumbler. But what God's Spirit is convicting us to be is burden bearers. Let me ask you this. As you've reached out, hopefully, to your brothers and sisters in Christ over the last 3 weeks, have you sought to bear burdens, or have you sought to complain? What about if you've received the phone call? Have you grumbled, or have you sought to bear others' burdens? I think very naturally we can grumble. But what we have to do is bear burdens. I'm sure all of us have missed Captola over the last 3 weeks. And one thing that Captola says almost every time you see her is, what do I have to complain about? What do I have to complain about? Well, probably quite a bit more than me. I'm sure her body is filled with far more aches and pains than I do. And she has to go through so many different emotions and tests just that come with age and life experiences and things she's been through. But have you ever, I mean, y'all want you to think through this. Have y'all ever heard Captola complain about anything? As the minister here, the elders and I probably hear more gripes and complaints and grumbles than anybody. I have not heard her complain about anything ever once. Never, never, never. And yet there have been countless times that she has asked how I'm doing and what I need and sought to build me up. It's about once a month that she'll come up and she'll say, "Now, Ryan, I've not told you this in a little bit, but that was a good sermon you had this morning." And that means the world. Brethren, what influence do we have? I mean, isn't that as a congregation what we're trying to think through this year, leadership and influence? What influence do I have on other people? What direction do I give to other people? Am I a grumbler or am I a burden bearer? It's a very simple question, and I don't need to belabor the point. Y'all understand the application. But I would urge us to take complaining very seriously. Complaining is a sin, period. Complaining is a sin. And what we need to do is repent of our grumblings, and we need to repent of our complaints, and we need to seek to bear the burdens of others. Because, verse 13, no temptation has taken you that is not overcommon to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to bear it and endure it. The reason we are able to endure life's trials is because of people that bear our burdens. If we want to endure and we want to make it to the promised land together, we do not need to grumble and we do not need to complain, but we need to bear burdens. Well, my invitation for this morning is probably quite different from a normal invitation, of course. As y'all know, I'm talking to my office. But this is the type sermon that perhaps you just need to pause the audio or the video right now, and you just need to go to God in prayer, and you need to ask for forgiveness. And you need to ask for healing and holiness, righteousness and holiness, justification and sanctification. That molded in the image of Christ, you can do better. Putting off grumbling and complaining and putting on encouragement and burden bearing. That needs to be the content of our lips. That needs to be the call of our hearts. That we do not complain, but we bear one another's burdens. My second invitation I offer this morning is this. We still have the opportunity to come to the Lord. Although the world around us is griping and complaining about everything that is going on, this is the time for our light to shine, to show that, y'all know, I mean, this is no secret. I have been sick of Facebook for years. It's a necessary evil in my life for me to stay in contact with people that I wouldn't see otherwise. But even over the last 3 weeks, it is filled with nothing, hardly anything, but complaints and gripes, just that are endless. And yet, amidst all of that darkness, I have seen some Christians that are seeking to encourage and build up. That's what we need to do. We need to be the burden bearers who do not gripe and complain about this world, but we seek to be the instruments of God's righteousness. Because 2 Corinthians 5 tells us we are the righteousness of God, and we are to be the instruments through whom God seeks to manifest his righteousness to this world. If you need that righteousness and you need to put it on in baptism, now's the time, because you'll come up as a new creation who is embodied with God's righteousness, that you may be an instrument who bears others' burdens and bring God's righteousness to this world. That's the call of the gospel. Thank you so much for listening this morning, and I look forward to hearing from you.